Thunder Strike Back, -4 Lightning. Author, Wild Wolverine Return. During their training at TACTA, Indian Air Force's Air Combat Tactical School, Goya and Jafar had several chances against the more advanced Mirage 2000-5, a tough fighter, and the first few air battles, the powerful Su-30 is not cheap, but gradually they found that the Mirage 2000 could not maintain the turning angular speed continuously. Although its instant hovering ability is impressive, in fact, low-altitude hovering has never been the strength of the Mirage aircraft. Later, they summed up some experience, as long as the air combat is introduced into the low altitude, and the continuous circling without turning on the afterburner, the senior instructors of TACTA will also lose in the end. However, the flexibility of the opponent in front of him exceeded Goya's expectations. The series of circling pursuits between the two sides continued, both trying to occupy a favorable position. Most of the time, both sides maintained the other's 3/9 o'clock position. The chase went all the way to a low altitude of several hundred meters, and there was not enough safe height for any aircraft to make a strong circle to point the nose at the opponent. The Su-30's vector nozzles couldn't be cheap for a while. Goya knew that too much fuel in the fuselage and 6 bulky semi-active radar-guided missiles under the wings had become a hassle to restrain himself from making super maneuvers. You also have to control the throttle stick at all times to prevent accidentally drilling in front of your opponent. I can't use it any longer, I have to give him some hardship. The lieutenant's left hand pressed the helmet sight button on the throttle valve. Why is it here? His eyes took off the head-up display, and at the same time he reduced the G-force to turn a small bank, watching the opponent gradually seize on the right side, passing the 9 the vantage point of the o'clock, but this is just a lieutenant's conspiracy to ensure that the bandit can't use a dive, from the bottom of the line of sight, to escape the aiming ring in the lower left corner of the helmet. Now the aiming ring is firmly aimed at the opponent, the lieutenant's hand is on the launch button. Wait a few seconds, the lock will be complete, and he quietly waits for everything to happen. The cunning opponent seemed to sense it immediately, and pulled up with an abnormal vertical climb, decisively giving up the advantage at hand. The lieutenant's line of sight followed closely, and the prey was already at hand. In an instant, the glare of the sun obscured the optical display on the helmet's sight, and it was a deadly lost item. Damn pig! Goya scolded. He didn't know whether the opponent's abnormal evasion was a coincidence or a godlike determination. A tenth of a second before the lock sign appeared, the lieutenant pressed the launch button almost reflexively, and the last of the precious R-73 flew off the pylon and made a huge off-axis turn towards the target. The minimum turning radius that the missile can do, but it obviously won't hit. The opponent immediately took a dive to increase the speed, and at the same time released a series of tracer bullets, and the airspace suddenly exploded into pieces of white smoke and fire. The R-73 missile found that it had missed the optimum angle to attack the tail of that aircraft before it had turned the seeker on its target with a turn of more than 35 g. It missed the aircraft and flew blindly out of the battlefield. Goya lost the killer weapon in his hand, and his remaining R-27 could not use the helmet to aim and fire, and he had no advantage in close combat. At this moment, the enemy plane has left the weapon envelope far away. With a simple and neat tilting and sliding action, he quickly occupied Captain Goya's 7 o'clock direction. He almost knocked down the hillside, but the situation of offense and defense finally changed. The radar warning device of the Su-30 has been silent all the time, and it has never been found to bite its own radar beam. This is normal. Maybe the other party just wants to use infrared missiles. Have chaff and glitter grenades ready, shouted the lieutenant, in shock for the first time in his life. Goya began to try to get rid of the tracking in the usual way, but his situation is very bad right now. He does not have enough altitude, the speed is only a little more than 400 kilometers, and it takes a long tens of seconds to accelerate, and the speed and altitude of the trailing enemy aircraft are lower. But sadly, he can fire now. Goya's Su-30 had almost fallen into a no-escape zone if the aircraft behind wanted to fire. but oddly enough, the seasoned Pakistani pilot didn't do it. What does he want to do? Goya thought to himself, if it was a fighting exercise, he could already be sentenced to death in such a situation. He stubbornly pushed the throttle valve to the afterburner position, and waited a long 10 seconds to increase the speed as much as possible, but this was not an overnight thing. He hoped that the opponent would still show kindness and give him a few more seconds, so that he could have enough speed to do a high G-force evasion to dodge the missile at the tail. If there is not enough speed, the turn must be soft. Ghaffar had been looking left and right to observe the trailing opponent and the missiles under its wings. It was clear that the opponent did have 2 glittering missiles under its wings. "He's accelerating inwards, 5 o'clock below," shouted Jafar, thinking to himself that the Pakistani pilot's brain must have been short-circuited. The opponent started to cut in, another odd move, and he was trying to make a lead turn, which is usually a move before the cannon is used to give the shot a lead. His missile must be malfunctioning. Goya suddenly had a flash of inspiration and immediately guessed the reason. The guy must have pressed the launch button, but the missile did not leave the launcher. So he delusionally shoots down a Su-30 with machine guns. It's fucking whimsical. The lieutenant flipped the joystick and began to serpentine evasion to disrupt the opponent's aim, and it didn't take long to get out of the opponent's gun range. Soon, driven by 2 powerful engines, the height of the Su-30 increased to 900 meters, and the speed was close to 700 kilometers per hour. The distance between the 2 planes began to increase significantly. Jafar visually estimated that it had exceeded 2 kilometers. The opponent had not pursued with full afterburner. The lieutenant was confident that he had escaped the range of the cannon. When he looked back, the plane behind had given up the pursuit, and suddenly slipped away in a reverse turn toward the mountains to the west. He ran away. Jafar couldn't believe his eyes. He saw the other party hovering down and flying away. "He's out of fuel." "That must be the case," Goya said, now in a panic, but regaining the confidence to fight back, checking the main flight instruments a little, and turning quickly. Within minutes, he went from prey to hunter again. He thought that this time, the help of the gods in the dark was a big help, but there is nothing to be embarrassed about. The war has always been just about the outcome. It was obvious that the low-altitude sneak attack, coupled with a series of low-altitude maneuvers, made the Pakistani fighter of an unknown model run out of fuel, and with his malfunctioning weapon, it was a good opportunity to kill him in one go. This was an aircraft that Lieutenant Jafar had never seen before, with clean lines and a light gray color that was commonly used by the Air Force. This was not any legal Phantom aircraft. Lieutenant Goya decided to cross the border and continue the pursuit. He had a hunch that if the pilot was left alive, it would be a trouble for the Indian Air Force in the future. "Look, it looks like an F-16 from the back," Jafar exclaimed in surprise. "No, I think it's a Thunderbolt." Goya suddenly remembered. The Air Force never forces pilots to remember the enemy aircraft identification list, because the attitude of the aircraft in the air is always different from the drawing on the paper, and the fighter jets owned by the Pakistani Air Force have always been so few, so they don't worry about not being able to identify them. But today was an exception. The lieutenant saw a new type of enemy plane that had never been on the front line. "Why is it more difficult than the F-16? Goya sighed. At this time, his radar aperture has caught the fleeing opponent, and the fire control system is transitioning from scanning to tracking, and missiles can be launched soon. Is it possible that I have a chance to win?" Goya couldn't believe it for a while. Because the enemy plane flew without panic and did not accelerate, it seems that his RWS did not remind him that death was imminent. At the critical moment, Goya couldn't take his eyes off the head-up display. He could only rely on Jafar to remind him from time to time that after crossing the border, on the radar warning device, RWS, the radar wave scans of some enemies in different directions were displayed from time to time. Some are long-range anti-aircraft missiles, but Goya estimates that the low-altitude position where his Su-30 is now is probably still outside their attack envelope, and he must not let such an opportunity go. "We can't go too far into their borders," Lieutenant Jaffer reminded. "Where are we now?" "It's 5 kilometers beyond the border, almost due west. Give me a few more minutes and I'll knock him down." The lieutenant lowered the plane to a dangerous altitude, and the R-27 missile could be launched in a downward-looking way, but he knew that if it was launched in this way, the missile's hit rate would not be too high, because the missile would be disturbed by ground reflections. Finally, his altitude dropped again to less than 600 meters, relative altitude. The latitude of this area is high, and the altitude measured by radio refers to the actual ground, not the sea level. He put himself on the same plane as the bandit. The enemy plane in front appeared and disappeared from time to time, flying close to the mountain, and it seemed that he deliberately did not use all his strength to get rid of it. Why doesn't he accelerate? It might just be because he's running out of fuel. If he wants to play tricks, it shouldn't be like this, right? Goya said. In fact, he was very uneasy. The display that the weapon is allowed to fire has appeared. The lieutenant chose 2 R-27 salvos to fire at the opponent, and then pressed the fire button. The fighter jet shook slightly, and the 2 missiles left the pylon one after another with a time difference of 1.5 seconds.